Illinois LiberTEA vetting call with Joe Kopsick. The date is July 19th at 8:30. On the call we have Joe Kopsick, Tim Goodcase, and Bill Collins.
And yourself.
Yes, and myself, of course. I have a list of questions I've got worked up, and then we'll just kind of go on categories. So, Joe, could you give us an introduction to yourself and what you're about?
Yes, my name is Joseph William Kopsick. I'm 29. I live in Lake Bluff, Illinois. That's in Illinois' 10th district, and I'm running as a write-in candidate. Not technically as an independent, but I'm trying to get the nominations or endorsement of the Libertarian and Constitution Party. I'm waiting to hear back from them. I won't be on the ballot, but I'm the only other candidate in the race besides incumbent Republican Bob Dole and challenger Brad Schneider. I'm running because I see a lack of diversity in ideology and fidelity to ideological consistency among the candidates that are running. I feel they're a little too moderate. I feel they don't represent the mainstream of their parties. And they both support a bigger government, and I favor more personal freedom in both the social and economic realms, reducing the size of the federal workforce, eliminating between 5 and 8 unconstitutional cabinet departments, and I would hope to reduce the budget by between $500 billion. I've proposed an outline of a budget that would reduce it by $1.25 trillion. I'm shocked to find the budget has actually increased in the last 6 years. It went from 3.7 to 3.9. So large amounts of proposed cuts, I think, are still in order, especially in the Department of Commerce.
First category we're going to go into is Constitution and government. What is the purpose of government?
The purpose of government is to ensure that people abide by the contracts that they make between themselves, and to make sure that big government doesn't interfere with the type of contracts that can be made. The purpose of the state and local governments are a lot more broad than the federal government. The federal government's main responsibilities, arguably only responsibilities, are military, Treasury, and a few things relating to establishing post roads and patents. As a federal candidate, I would support much less federal government involvement in the realms of health, education, welfare, housing.
Do you believe that the U.S. Constitution is so relevant as the supreme law of the land and needs to be obeyed and upheld by the President, Congressmen, Senators, judges, all elected officials, and government employees?
I believe it does. I think there are several clauses in the Constitution that have been overly broadly interpreted to excuse more federal intervention in state and local affairs. The purpose of the President is to enforce the laws that Congress passes, if they were duly passed. The Supreme Court and the President should not be in the business of making law. The Supreme Court should be interpreting it.
You kind of overlaid into my next question there. Do you believe that the interpretation of the Constitution can change with time and should be ruled as such by Supreme Court judges?
I don't think it should. The Bill of Rights, I think, needs to be strengthened to be more in line with its original intent. If there are to be any alterations of the Bill of Rights, it should not be with what the majority thinks today. It should be the original intent.
What actions do you think should be taken when elected federal officials violate their oath of office to uphold the Constitution?
In the case of Kim Davis in Kentucky, for example, I realized that the only way to get her out of office was to actually put her in jail. I don't favor the jailing of people. I think maybe if they have any kind of license to practice law, revoking that I think would be a more humane punishment if they violate their oaths than putting them in jail. I thought that was ridiculous in that case. I mean, of course, if they're involved in violent crimes or huge amounts of corruption, then jail would be possibly appropriate.
What is your stand on federally controlled education?
I don't think the federal government should be involved in education. Department of Education has only existed for about 50 years or less, not 220 years. I think we have 50 states that can put forth their best solution and see how that works for their local electorates, and perhaps if several states or one state shows to be the Joseph implemented the best set of examples, then the federal government could try to emulate it constitutionally. So I would vote to support the abolition of the Department of Education, urge states and localities to just experiment with whatever they think best.
What is your view on federal college assistance?
I don't think the federal government should be in the business of making college loans. That was never in the enumerated powers of the federal government. I would do nothing to stop states from doing that. I would recommend that they not tax income or sales in order to fund that. I would support no federal involvement in college or before college education.
That subject actually was debated by our founding fathers, and they had all agreed that it should be a local issue. On your questionnaire under what is your view of monetary system in the U.S. today, you put government should not limit the development of new and alternative currencies. Are you aware that there are constitutional requirements actually on that?
No, I'm not. I'm aware the Constitution sets gold and silver as the only legal currency. No, I'm not aware of any constitutional limits on that.
That's exactly what I'm meaning on the gold and silver.
Mm-hmm. I do favor returning to gold and silver currencies, or perhaps silver certificates. I don't think the Federal Reserve unit accounting dollar is. I think we need to put the Federal Reserve, the activities of the Federal Reserve, back under congressional control, but allow states and localities to issue their own currencies.
Agreed. And I've noticed that you are definitely a supporter of auditing and abolishing the Federal Reserve. I like that.
I would call out Bernie Sanders for watering down Rand Paul's bill to audit the Fed. I think there should be an annual audit, and I think eventually it should be phased out and put under congressional control.
What is your view on minimum wage?
I don't support minimum wage increases. I think minimum wage increases lead to a spiral of price inflation. I think as alternatives to the minimum wage, I think we need to focus on increasing the value of the dollar so it can buy what the people who want to earn a $15 minimum wage need to buy. And a way to decrease prices while strengthening the dollar is to decrease or abolish sales taxes of all kinds, including luxury taxes and tariffs, and with a strengthened dollar, ordinary goods like food and shelter and medicine would be able to be more easily afforded by people working 30 to 40 hours or potentially more than 40, but not earning past poverty levels.
Does the federal government have the authority to create and enforce a national minimum wage?
I believe it does only to federal employees. I'm not sure that that it exactly falls under the enumerated powers. I don't think it does, but the federal government obviously has employees and votes and are represented to determine those wages. So I'm aware that when the president calls for a $10.50 minimum wage, not everyone notices that he's only talking about federal employees, and he's just setting a standard that he'd like other businesses in the country to try to achieve, but he doesn't really make that clear.
Related question in regards to pensions. Do you think federal employees or elected officials should have pensions?
I don't see any issue with federal employees having pensions. Are you talking about private pensions versus public pensions? Like whether they should be phased out into private control?
It would be mostly in regards to within the federal control, the federal funded pension.
If people want to have federal funded pensions, I think those revenues have to be collected constitutionally. I would prefer they be collected voluntarily. I should honestly say I'm not too familiar with the issues of government pensions, but when it comes to transitioning those, I'm certainly in favor of opting out if people want to do that. But if people want to have their pensions managed by a private company, that's fine. I would also urge people to look into mutual funds for their pensions because there's the profit-oriented private sector, and then there's the nonprofit private sector that still falls outside of the realm of the state. So it's not what we traditionally consider private sector. So I favor allowing people to transition their pensions into private funds, but clarifying that private just means non-state. It doesn't necessarily mean a for-profit organization. I would encourage people to look into, consumer credit unions and things like that.
For elected officials, do you think they should have pensions?
I think they should, but I think it should be limited. I don't like hearing that, you know, people still receive large amounts of money until decades past their retirement. I would look into, you know, curbing the amount of benefits that, you know, retired elected officials receive.
As an example, Illinois elected officials can draw a pension after only 8 years. For part-time work, what is your view on that?
I think that's a bit too soon. I think something like 15, 20 years would be more appropriate. As a federal candidate, I wouldn't really have any role in that.
I'm not sure what the requirements is for pension for federal. What do you feel on the issue of term limits?
I think U.S. House members should be limited to 4 or 5 consecutive terms. I think senators should be limited to 2 consecutive terms. I'm fine with keeping the executive the way it is. Supreme Court, I would support any bill that would limit their terms to maybe 20 or 30 years. I think it's important to have people with experience in office, but some of these senators have been in for 30, 36 years. Limit the number of consecutive terms. It means if the people really like a politician, they can keep voting them in. They just might have to wait, you know, 2 or 6 years before they can have them back again. That wouldn't serve to, you know, keep one candidate out. It would help change things up. If a party has no way of defeating a certain candidate, at least have another person from the same party be in, so at least, you know, something can change.
On the questionnaire under should the U.S. Maintain its standing army, explain. You had mentioned U.S. should maintain its standing army, but a constitutional convention should be called to restore the Second Amendment to its original intent. Can you please explain that?
The original intent of the Second Amendment was to help the populace defend itself against a tyrannical government. The purpose of having guns to do this is specifically to prevent an army from conscripting you into it, whether it's the British or the American or some other army. The purpose of the Second Amendment was to protect the right of conscientious objection.
I'm just curious how you think it needs to be amended. I think it's pretty clear they have no right to restrict us.
Right.
It
Well,
says shall not be infringed. It's pretty clear.
Yeah, I do. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't. They don't understand it, and they think words that aren't in it are in it. So I think restoring it to the way it was just several months before it was adopted into the Bill of Rights, it's about twice as long, and it specifically mentions not conscientious objection, but people religiously scrupulous of bearing arms shall not be required to render military service in person. And then it continues on with the Second Amendment we know today. So it used to be twice as long.
Really?
Yes.
I would be interested in seeing that. I've never seen that. Okay, I thought it was pretty clear. They're not supposed to touch.
Right.
What is your reaction to the changes made in the military by the current and previous administration?
I think we need to make sure to keep standards of physical fitness high. I have no problem with women or gays or anyone who's qualified being allowed in the military. It's just they should pass the same physical fitness expectations that men have and that are currently implemented.
I was in the military when, I don't recall if the Don't Ask, Don't Tell was actually enforced. I was in the military in the early 80s. And I guarantee there were gays in the military. They just didn't make it obvious. See what people's objection was to the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy was. My personal feeling is that the allowing of them to be totally flagrant actually causes strife within the military, especially when they're requiring military to go through gay tolerance training. I think that's like forcing it on people.
When you were in that, I didn't have Don't Ask, Don't Tell. I joined the Navy in 1985, and at that time, our recruiters asked people whether they were gay, and if someone said yes, then they weren't allowed to join. And then while somebody's in the service, if anybody found out they were gay, they would get discharged as soon as possible.
Well, I'm pretty sure I was never asked. I joined in 82, delayed entry. And then I got out in 85. Ironically, I had a good friend over in Germany that was your regular flinger. He did everything he could trying to get out of the military. He even tried telling him he was gay, and it didn't work. I personally feel that that test they've gone to, though, actually creates more problems than it solves.
Do you think the sensitivity training is unnecessary? Are you aware of any budgetary problems with that? Like, do you think it could have gone just like let gays serve openly without having the sensitivity training?
Yeah, I don't think it was necessary. Now, I don't think it's necessary to force it on anybody, which, in my opinion, that's exactly what they're doing with that. I mean, what you do behind closed door, in my opinion, is your own business. Just don't force it on me.
Well, we're talking about military requirements. I wouldn't support drafting women. I would introduce or support legislation to abolish the draft, in addition to strengthening the Second Amendment to be about guns and the draft, to make it clear to people what the Second Amendment's about.
Where do you stand on veteran and disabled veteran benefits?
I should confess I don't know all too much about the Veterans Department as an issue. Obviously, bureaucracy is a problem. I wouldn't support any cuts to the Veterans Department until we can get the mess straightened out, get health and education and job training to people. I would honestly have to rely on the electorate for more information on veterans issues.
On the questionnaire, under what controls, if any, should be placed on the right to own a gun? I was kind of confused with the end of what you said here. I do not believe that the law should interfere with people's right to sue gun sellers and manufacturers, but that doesn't mean I don't believe that once a gun is sold to you, you take full responsibility with what you do with it. Could you elaborate a little more and explain that, please?
I don't think there should be any federal laws on guns. I don't have any problem with the states regulating that as they see fit, as long as they don't make it impossible to transport guns across state lines for the purpose of sale. The suing gun manufacturers, right? I wouldn't support those lawsuits, but I wouldn't pass any law that interferes with the ability of any person to sue any other person, because it's part of the U.S. Code. That no state shall interfere with the right of anyone to sue any person or entity within the United States.
A lot of these cases that we're seeing where the gun manufacturers are being sued, they're holding the gun manufacturers responsible for an individual. What is your stand on that?
I don't think it's right, but I think ultimately it should be left up to juries, and I think nowadays juries also have too little power compared to judges, prosecutors, and even publicly appointed defense attorneys. There should be less instructions telling juries that they have to find this or that way if they see these X or Y or Z facts in the case. I don't want to interfere with any right to sue because I don't want to disempower juries. It's unfortunate that the outcome of allowing those lawsuits would hold gun manufacturers liable, but I think by strengthening the Second Amendment, people would understand a lot better that the federal government does not have a right to interfere with that, and hopefully those lawsuits would only take place on a state and local level.
What will you do if elected to help correct the overreach of government and denial of the right to bear arms?
As far as overreach in government, support abolishing between 5 and 8 federal departments, including Commerce, Education, Energy, Interior, Health and Human Services, and if not an abolition, then a restructuring of the Department of Homeland Security. The public discourse has to be kind of made clear. We're seeing with the police shootings of civilians and civilian shootings of police that MSNBC is interviewing black people saying that they need guns to protect themselves. I think that public consciousness and favor of the Second Amendment is going to fall back into popularity. To clarify in the public mindset what the Second Amendment means will help advance an agenda to eventually abolish federal gun legislation and control.
You seem to have a pretty good grip on that. Should the federal government be allowed to intervene when state laws violate the Bill of Rights?
No, they shouldn't. States signed the Constitution, and they had the federal government recognize those individual rights. States, for example, have right to pass gun control. Obviously, there are huge portions of the Bill of Rights I wouldn't favor the states trampling on, but I would favor the right of civil disobedience and local individual rights.
What would you consider the federal government role would be like on a state that is just totally trampling the Bill of Rights?
Federal government would still have the right to protect the affairs of individuals, any individuals and companies involved in interstate commerce. An individual always has the right to sue its state federal court.
From your website, let me quote you here, I would also support amending the Constitution to permit multiple seceding states to form into confederations. And I would urge the states to amend their constitutions to permit citizens to terminate their state citizenship. That kind of threw me there. All you need to do is move to terminate your state citizenship. I'm not aware of anything in the Constitution that forbids secession.
It doesn't forbid secession, but it does forbid confederation, and which kind of baffles me because I would think as states secede, the Constitution would not any longer apply to them, and they'd be able to form into confederations. I would support this position with reference to the 1783, I think, Treaty of Paris, where Britain and America recognized that the U.S. is composed of free, sovereign, and independent states. And I think that that principle needs to be, it has been recognized today in modern times as recently as 7 years ago. I'm sure still that provision of the treaty is regarded by the federal government as only one of 10 points of the treaty that is still effective, but it does recognize the United States as free, sovereign, and independent nations. So I think if they originally had the right to form into a confederacy and to secede, then they should still have those rights.
On immigration, what do you see as number one problem in immigration?
I don't support the building of a wall. I think we should have bare minimum vetting for immigrants, make sure they're healthy. I do support deporting violent criminals. I don't think illegal immigrants should be detained and arrested and deported for minor crimes unless they're a violent criminal, in which case I would favor them being deported. I don't support English as a national language. I don't believe that the act of illegal immigration is actually a crime in the sense of that a crime has a victim. It would be easy to argue that the taxpayers are the victims, but I think expansive federal involvement in health and education makes this problem worse. I think it should be left up to the states how to deal with the welfare needs of illegal immigrants. I wouldn't favor just welfare to address that problem. I would favor the free market and nonprofits and charity organizations. I think a lot of the drug problem is blamed on immigration too. I favor liberalizing drug laws, and I think a lot of the fear would subside with that if we start arresting our own citizens only for violent crimes, not nonviolent drug crimes. Then I think we'd see less crime among immigrants.
So you don't think that the immigration laws should be enforced?
As a public official, I would have to say that they would have to be enforced, but I don't agree with them. I think immigration, at least developing a uniform rule of naturalization, that's the province of the federal government. Immigration should largely, or for the most part, be policed by the federal government, but as far as receiving benefits, I think that should be a local issue.
Are you aware that aiding and abetting illegals is a felony?
Yes, I think that law should be changed. I don't think there's really anything wrong with giving charitably or housing a person just depending on their legal status unless they're a violent criminal.
Where do you stand on amnesty?
I think it would be difficult to deport tens of millions of people. I don't think it would really be effective in achieving what we want. I don't really favor a blanket amnesty. I think there should be a path to citizenship and a path to legal work. I think it should be easier to get into the country legally and to get legal employment. I think a lot of those legal barriers would be reduced by not requiring people to pay taxes and be in Social Security and pay for welfare. I would favor more or less a form of amnesty for people who are not violent criminals. In many cases, these were youths brought to this country without their knowledge and against their will before they, while they were young children or before they reach the age of consent. So I think those people should be allowed to apply for U.S. citizenship once they turn 18. I would only favor that if Congress can pass such a bill. If the executive wants it and tries to push it through, I don't think that's appropriate. I would agree with him in sentiment, but the legal approach I would have a problem with. And that's what I did have a problem with 5 years ago when DACA and DAPA were passed.
Do you agree with those executive orders that allow immigration?
Legally, I don't agree with them because I think the executive branch should not be in the business of making law. I would favor a Congress supporting similar legislation and the president signing it and enforcing it. But when it comes from the president or the executive branch, I have constitutional issues with it. If I were presented with the opportunity to vote for or against that, if I have to vote against it.
What is the purpose of executive orders?
Basically to clarify how a law is to be enforced.
We need to educate you a little more on that. The only purpose for executive orders is to direct the executive branch, nothing else. They are not legally binding outside of the executive branch, which has been a real problem we've had with many presidents, thinking they can just write an executive order and enforce it as legal on everybody else. The abuse of executive orders has been going on for quite some time. It's just been gradually getting worse and worse with each administration. Under your answer for do you know what Agenda 21 is, communitarian agenda, you have I support imposing fees on non-sustainable development and on blight and disuse of land in order to take the tax burden off of income earners by Irish business and in order to implement a taxation regime that punishes destruction of our planet instead of discouraging production and taxes away productive development and of private property and the commons. That confused me. I'm not sure exactly what you're saying there.
Yeah, so that is part of my integrative approach to environment and taxes. I am aware of how federal regulations on the environment protecting endangered species, I'm aware of how that interferes with the development of cities and businesses. I wouldn't want to interfere with the growth of business, but I think a good way to promote the growth of business and promote people earning income is to stop taxing income, stop taxing sales, stop taxing investment and tariffs, and reform property taxes in a way that allows government to ensure that the environment is protected by imposing fees on blight, pollution, disuse of land, and making sure that people who extract natural resources give money to the community in exchange for that right to extract those natural resources.
When you say blight, to me as a gardener, that's not really anything we control. So how would you justify that? I'm fighting blight on my tomatoes just about every year.
People who own small amounts of landed property and have blight, they might actually face, no tax burden. Any companies or large landowners, I certainly think the government shouldn't help them protect their property. But at worst, if they're doing active harm to the community through pollution, I think they should be required to compensate the community for refraining from using their land when the public would otherwise be able to derive some kind of productive use for it. So I think our property taxes right now, I think they serve to discourage growth in property values because they tax away property values instead of imposing fees on people for refraining from developing their properties. When it comes to small plots, though, it almost not favor into the taxes at all. Every household would probably have some kind of essentially a tax credit. You don't want to tax ordinary people for having small amounts of land that just because of nature is unable to use. But people who own large amounts of land that the government protects, I think we should remove that protection as a privilege instead of bailing them out or continuing to protect them when they don't make any use of the land. They just make it so that other people can't use it.
Well, what about private property rights on that?
Right now, we basically don't have full private property rights. Ordinary citizens should be allowed to own landed property and explore for resources within them as long as they have to pay some dividend to the community in exchange for the right to drill on that. We don't really have full private property rights in terms of like allodial property. I think we should experiment with that. I think having states approach that differently would help address that problem. We could have private property owned by small household level landowners.
In my area, we actually do still have property rights. We have not allowed our city to violate them. We had a mayor that was talking about making an ordinance on how high your grass could be and et cetera, and we all threatened to have them arrested for violating our property rights. End of discussion on it. In my area, it's not as big of an issue. I know in some of these, a lot of the other areas in Illinois, people basically have no property rights.
And that they have to comply with codes that says they can't build things that would, could attract people to their property and allow them to derive some kind of use from it. The value of that use would otherwise just be taxed away if we continue property taxes the way they are now.
I guess part of your answer was also confusing to me about the Agenda 21 in sustainable development. You say you don't support the Agenda 21, but yet you do believe that demands for sustainable development and other environmental regulations can and often do hamper industrial development and productivity. The tendency with Agenda 21 is that they do impose regulations that take away your property rights. Comes out of the UN. The whole thing is being brought about local area, but through NGOs, non-governmental organizations. I'm running for county board, I would want to try to block these NGOs from instituting any regulations because they are unaccountable to the voters. They didn't get elected. They're just in this non-governmental organization that starts instituting these regulations and these rules.
Are these international non-government organizations?
They tend to be like regional. They may incorporate 2 or 3 or 4 counties together, and they form a local organization. They start creating these regulations. In my opinion, it's not really enforceable.
A lot of them do also have ties with the UN.
I would push for much less U.S. involvement in the UN. The states and local governments who are supposed to regulate the environment. I don't think there should be any federal standards for pollution, vehicle emissions.
So with that statement, do you think the EPA should go away, or?
Yeah, I think it's unnecessary. The federal government's really only supposed to have exclusive jurisdiction over 64 square miles and maybe some outlying islands. I think the states could regulate the environment. I think there wouldn't really be a need for the federal government to. I would encourage state and local governments to implement community land and water trusts and start building an economy and maybe even a currency based on that state's main exports. Wouldn't interfere with state and local governments starting citizens' dividends to provide people with dividends of that state's exports or products.
Federal government only has lands, especially in the West. We don't have that much here in the Midwest, but do you think that the federal government should turn that land over to the state?
I think it should, and I favor as much local responsibilities in taking care of that land as possible. I would support the abolition of the Department of the Interior. I think the federal government shouldn't exercise jurisdiction outside of D.C. and our overseas possessions. There's nothing that says the government has the right to own land. It has the right to establish post roads, not to build roads necessarily. It doesn't specifically authorize Interstate Highway Commission, and it doesn't have the right to, shouldn't have the right to own all of the lands around the transportation infrastructure. They're going to disuse when people need homes and often camp on these lands. A lot of these lands aren't being put to good use, and I think the states, the localities, and community land trusts or things similar to that, I think they would be better caretakers of those lands.
What is your take on the Bundy issues out in Oregon and the Bureau of Land Management?
I was on the side of the Bundys and the Hammonds, Ryan or Ammon Bundy, maybe not them, but someone was talking about the Hammonds issue, mentioning how the federal government was violating several of their rights in the Bill of Rights. They were claiming they subjected them to double jeopardy and were interfering with their gun rights and their right to free speech. A lot of liberals were saying the federal government should drone strike these people. I thought that was really vitriolic. When we have a federal government that is occupying virtually this entire country, a couple guys with guns occupying a bird refuge after some forest fires that went not exactly clarified. People think these guys are going around setting fires. They're setting fires to stop other fires. Even if a couple of deer were illegally poached, it's not something that excuses the federal government's intrusion into land management in the West. I think over 50% of Oregon is owned by the federal government. It might be up to 80 and 90% in some states. I would definitely stand against that.
One of the requirements for probation was that they turn their land over to the government.
Mm-hmm. Well, that was probably it's the government's aim since about 10, 15 years ago when this started.
So we actually do have Stand By Me coming to Liberty Fest. Looking forward to hearing what Ricky Douglas has to say on the issue.
What is Stand By Me?
It is a fairly new group in support of the Bundys and Hammonds and other situations that were like that.
A couple other things about Lavoy Finicum. People have this idea in their head that the federal government and the Democrats are on the side of Native Americans. And here we saw several days before he was shot by police, Lavoy Finicum showing on video how the federal government was mishandling Indian artifacts, like keeping them outside the doors of the refuge instead of, in somewhere in safekeeping. Lavoy Finicum had Native American heritage. The federal government has a history of trampling on contracts with tribes. And also the way he was shot, I think it really shows the public that if a police officer tells you to hold your hands up and you aren't exactly able to keep your stance even for a second, they'll think you're going for a gun. That happens whether it's a black person, a white person.
I watched the videos, and it was very, very clear to me that that was an execution. He had his hands up.
Yeah.
Next category I've got is GMOs. There's evidence that the use of GMOs in our food can be harmful to our health. What is your stand on truth and labeling for the currently hidden GMOs?
I think the federal government, it kind of arguably has a role in that, right? Because federal involvement in interstate commerce has been justified as long as it increases consumer information. But I don't think that falls into the enumerated responsibilities of the federal government. I think people have the right to demand it from their states. It kind of creates an issue where, states might want to have labels showing that foods were brought in from places that don't have GMO labeling laws. Another issue is that without government to enforce consumer labeling, the public still might demand it. They would have to live with the fact that they might not always be able to get foods that have been labeled for whether they have GMOs or even inspected by the...
Do you feel the federal government has the right to prevent states from requiring GMO labeling?
In a way, I think it does, because if a state requires GMO labeling, as long as the food is produced entirely within state borders, without any labor or goods required for producing them coming from outside of the state, I think the state has jurisdiction over food growing and selling that's within its borders. But such a law could potentially kind of turn into a way for a state to favor protecting its own domestic food growth, the food production of that state over the food production that comes from other states. And I think that would be an intervention in commerce, the kind that the federal government should have an interest in preventing. So I'm not sure the federal government could always be trusted to do that.
One of the problems we are having is that the GMOs are contaminating organic and non-GMO grown foods. Do you feel this should be allowed to continue? Because what's happening is we got Monsanto suing organic farmers for them contaminating their organic food.
I would hope that the other food growers, not Monsanto, would win in those lawsuits, because Monsanto plants in such huge swaths of crops that it kind of can't help but that pollen falling onto other fields. If Monsanto can sue other farmers for planting their crops, then the farmer should be able to sue Monsanto for essentially sending that pollen or doing nothing to prevent that pollen from falling onto their property. You could even argue that the stuff that comes from Monsanto is pollution. I would favor people suing Monsanto. I'd favor not having the Secretary of Agriculture be a guy who won an award from Monsanto. I would favor removing any other protections from Monsanto and oppose any bailouts or favors or tax credits.
Does the federal government have the constitutional authority to legalize abortion?
I think the federal government should not interfere. I think the Supreme Court decision that abortion should be allowed until the point of viability, I think that's appropriate. Although the point of viability, I think, is debatable. Some people would say it's 6 months. Some people would say, I have argued that babies have been saved as early as 3 to 4 months. By and large, states have an authority to regulate that. I could only advocate for Illinois and localities in Illinois to take a position on that issue. I do favor partial birth abortion being prosecuted as murder, but I would go for revoking doctors' license to practice medicine temporarily or for long term, rather than having any kind of punishment on the woman, because treating abortion like murder would basically involve executing tens of millions of women. Of course, no one's advocating that. I think doctors who perform partial birth abortion should be recognized as having committed infanticide.
Should taxpayer funds fund organizations that support and perform abortion? Why or why not?
No, on the federal level, definitely not. I would support defunding Planned Parenthood, even for purposes not related to abortion, because those funds can always be diverted. My two opponents have been kind of wavering on this. Brad Schneider, more or less, the pro-choice candidate. Bob Dole has been on both sides of the issue. In my own morals, I don't have a problem with abortion before the point of viability. I don't think the federal government, it's not enumerated in the Constitution, the federal government has any responsibility to regulate abortion.
On your website, does the federal government have the authorized power to regulate marriage?
It doesn't. That's not enumerated in the Constitution. States have the authority to regulate that. I would favor governments of all kinds, all levels, getting out of marriage because I think that's a personal and sometimes religious contractual decision made between two people, and I think the provisions of that contract could be enforced without needing to get government involved. Communities could step in, private contract enforcement agencies. Any two people have the right to say they're married. I don't think they should have the right to demand rights based on that. I think whoever recognizes it, government, businesses, religious organizations, should have the right to, under most circumstances, should have the right to recognize that or not. But for the most part, I don't think marriage should entitle anyone to legal rights, and I would not support any federal regulation on marriage.
What is your opinion on the total perversion of the 14th Amendment by the Supreme Court on the subject?
In terms of the recent marriage ruling, I can't say I'm aware of how it interferes with the 14th Amendment. Are you saying because it requires states to recognize marriage?
When they decided to try to use the 14th on it, my first thought was, most of these people are not even 14th Amendment citizens. I'm natural born. I'm not a 14th Amendment citizen.
I've tried to understand that issue. I've failed a lot. As far as I understand, there's a few kind of debating schools of thought about how to retain natural born status. I definitely support people who want to just be citizens of their own state. I know people have to be really afraid that they will do the paperwork right and avoid declaring themselves as a federal citizen. I think a lot of people who have thought about it just think of it as kind of too risky, and so they become a federal citizen.
I was never given a choice. We automatically get birth certificates when we're born now, so.
How do you feel about people of the opposite sex going to the opposite washroom from what their gender is?
I think they should be dealt with as individuals. They should have the same rights and liberties as everyone else. I think they should be allowed to serve in the military, to get married, to adopt. As far as discrimination against transgender, I don't think government should discriminate against them. As for the private sector, and just as with every other minority group, or really anyone, even individual or majority, businesses should be allowed to exclude people who are being violent from their premises and not give them permission to enter. If people are not being violent and demanding access to a business, businesses should only be able to refuse them only if the businesses don't receive taxpayer funds or involved in interstate commerce. I think if you have a business that's only active in one state, it should be able to allow or disallow whatever patrons or potential patrons it pleases from coming onto their property and transacting with them. That's my general approach to the issue of discrimination, at least. I think there's going to be consumer demand for a third option or a gender-neutral option in bathrooms in public and private facilities. Government should be obligated to provide alternatives. Worried that states, North Carolina, for example, intruding into people's privacy, like even if someone is male or female, even if it says so on their driver's license, the police might not even inspect the driver's license. They might just profile a person, guess their gender incorrectly, and throw them out. There's going to be consumer demand for desegregated bathroom facilities, but private businesses should only be required to provide those options if the business does not exist purely based on voluntary given funds from customers. If they receive taxpayer funding, I think government has an interest to intervene to make sure that people have access to businesses that are receiving taxpayer funding and or located in more than one state.
What about my right to not want to have to share a bathroom with a biological male just because they feel like a woman?
You should also have the right to make sure that the businesses that you're going to have their own security personnel to enforce those rules. I think largely it should be up to the business. If you want to use the bathroom of your choice, you should have the right to only frequent businesses that regulate their bathroom usage in that way. People who don't want to do that can seek out businesses that conduct their bathroom rules more to their own choice.
Because right now, the way they're going at it, we're talking a very, very small fraction of our population is being given special privileges over the rest of us. Bathrooms in a lot of these places they're not designed for one person. I shouldn't be forced to have a guy peeing next to me, you know. To me, that is a risk to my safety because any pervert can claim they feel like a woman. I've actually had issues when I was younger of perverts hanging out at public bathrooms.
You know, keep in mind there are always same-sex perverts too, and violent people who use men's or women's rooms that do correspond with their sex, their assigned sex at birth. I favor a more well-armed populace to defend themselves. I favor some businesses being able to hire their own security guards to run their practices as they see fit. I think for the most part, gender neutral or having a third option or just having a system of one person only bathrooms, those are all approaches. I don't think they should replace what's going on now with bathrooms, but I think any businesses should be able to choose those solutions or to not choose them. Consumers' patronage of those businesses will reflect what the public wants.
So you're basically putting that back to business owner rights then?
Yes, for the most part, if businesses are located only within one state, they should have the right to do that.
In your opinion, what are the three biggest failures of our current Congress?
First, I'd say failing to stand up against Obamacare. I think a little more effort could have been put into that to be serious about repealing that. They tried dozens of times. I guess it just wasn't enough. I definitely disagree with how Congress voted to require women to register for the draft. That ultimately got defeated. I'm glad for that. I think Congress could have done more to propose legislation that's an alternative to the executive orders that are coming out of that branch, continuing our overseas military involvement to such a degree that we have been. I think that's a problem too. The President and Congress haven't worked together hard enough to do any of the things Obama promised in 2008, dismantling Guantanamo Bay, ceasing spying. I think both parties are responsible for the continued violation of the Fourth and Fifth Amendments.
Should you be elected, what will you do to help correct these failures?
I would form a bipartisan coalition that's based on civil liberties and peace. I would strengthen the Bill of Rights. I would make sure we only have a congressional declaration of war if we're going to go to war. I would favor bringing a lot of troops home, doing more with the funds that we're getting, making a better use of the funds, thinking about how to reform taxes. There are liberals who realize that low-income people are being taxed too much, conservatives who have a concern for getting people off welfare, providing a smooth transition from welfare or poverty to work. I would bring those people together to reduce mandatory minimum sentencing, bring together anyone and everyone who supports individual rights, the right to a trial, traditional American principles, people who are serious about curbing the influence of big government that causes all these problems with elections and unions. That's another issue I haven't gotten around to address. I don't support overturning Citizens United because I think the federal government is overexpansive, and I think big government is the cause of our elections being so contentious. I don't exactly, agree with the rhetoric, at least, that money is speech, but I think we have the right to spend our money as we see fit. It's a high-stakes political environment that makes unlimited campaign donations seem like a problem. They're only a symptom of the problem, which is big government.
Should the possession of small amounts of marijuana be decriminalized?
Yes, it should. I think the states should have the authority to regulate that, but we have a federal law against marijuana that is currently on the books right now. That law is unconstitutional and needs to be repealed.
You answered the next question. Is it the federal power?
Right. No, it's not.
Should doctors be allowed to prescribe marijuana to their patients for medicinal purposes?
Yes, but that should be a state's issue.
In your high school years, you were affiliated with the Green Party. Can you expand on that a little?
Yeah, I was raised in a Democratic household. My mother actually went to high school with Jill Stein. I've never met Jill Stein, but I did work for her former campaign director, Ben Mansky, for just about a month in Wisconsin, working on local issues, trying to get businesses to divest from the Chamber of Commerce, the Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce, the lobbying organization. I've never voted for a Green Party candidate, although when I was 14 I supported Ralph Nader. I supported Kerry over Bush, but I liked Nader more. That was before I was able to vote. The first vote I cast was for Ron Paul. In 2007 I discovered Dennis Kucinich and Mike Gravel, and I liked them, found out more about them, and eventually Mike Gravel became kind of more libertarian leaning before he retired from politics. As soon as I heard about Ron Paul in about May 2007. I was really attracted to his ideas. I've always supported civil liberties, and as long as I can remember, supported the 10th Amendment, realizing even the First Amendment doesn't exactly say what people think it does in terms of establishment of religion is one thing I wrote about in my high school newspaper. Up until 2007, I was kind of a liberal Democrat with a lot of pro-civil liberties. I became pro-gun during high school. Since Ron Paul came out in 2007, 2008, I became a lot more interested in the Treasury and the Federal Reserve and how all that works, and the free market capitalist view of economics and other economic schools of thought that are closely related to libertarian thought, such as the economic philosophy of Henry George and mutualism, and the more free market version of libertarianism, agorism, which involves like private defense and dispute resolution agencies.
Anything else you'd like to expand on, Joe?
I just want to mention just basic facts of my campaign. I have applied to the Lake County Clerk and Cook County Clerk to be a write-in candidate. I will not be on the ballot because I didn't get enough signatures. I am the only candidate besides Bob Dole and Brad Schneider. I hope to, for the most part, put my own ideals aside, while at least letting the public know about them, encouraging state and local governments to try whatever they think will work. I have recommendations, but I wouldn't aim to make them enforceable on those levels. I would just focus on obeying the letter of the law of the Constitution, protecting personal rights, not expanding government to the point where we have to plan for spending 75 years ahead of time, which will require doubling taxes until people my age are 70. I favor modestly scaling back Medicare and Social Security while encouraging states to pick up the slack. I would consider block grants. I would support cut, cap, and balanced budget amendments. I would hope to restrain federal spending to somewhere between 10 and 12.5% of GDP, hopefully a 2.5 or $3 trillion budget in the short term, within 5 years. That would be my goal. And I would support a balanced budget amendment as an amendment to the Constitution, as well as term limits.
Thank you very much for your time. I think we've learned quite a bit more. We'll be posting this recording here after a bit so those people can listen to it. We'll get back with you soon on whether you passed our vetting or not.
Okay, thank you very much. And could I just add one last note? In the federal candidate survey that I filled out for you guys had that my endorsements were Phil Collins, William Loebscher, Charles January, Mike Sock, and Dan Rutherford. I just wanted to add that Chad Coppy and Timothy Goodcase, who was on the call, have endorsed me. The endorsements from the Illinois Libertarian Party and the Constitution Party, those are in progress. I've heard both groups tell me that they will most likely endorse me, so I'm looking forward to hearing back from them soon, as well as confirming that my write-in candidacy has been properly filed.
Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
We will be getting back with you soon.
All right, thank you very much. Have a good night.